Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Dale Alexander. I'm a press secretary with the Banque du Canada. We have about 20 minutes for the press conference today. We ask you have one question and a quick follow-up, and we'll see if we can get through everyone in the 20 minutes. Comme d'habitude, libre à vous de poser vos questions dans la langue officielle de votre choix. And with that, we'll get started. Governor Poloz would be happy to take your question. Greg Quinn, Bloomberg, go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, Governor.
Greg?
You mentioned things like weather and some one-offs in inflation in recent data and data that's coming up. So are you going to set aside the first quarter data more because of some of the one-offs, or are you going to parse it much more closely to see where you're at in terms of getting back to your inflation target?
Well, I think we'll need to, we will never throw data aside, Greg, but so there's always a lot of value underneath, but we'll need to parse it carefully. You can only do so much to isolate effects that would be due to weather. A bit like last summer when we were trying to isolate the effects of the floods here in Canada. It's similar to that kind of exercise. Certain sectors are affected more by weather than others, so you kind of try to isolate things. So we're going to do our best. I mean, I would say right now, my bottom line assessment is that it's hard to believe that the softness we're seeing is all due to weather. It'd be hard to accept that. But it remains to be flushed out, and we'll do that for the monetary policy report 4 weeks from now. So I'll have a clearer picture for you on that.
A big theme of your speech was a global hangover and perhaps lower Wixellian rates. How Canada is part of the world. How much are we in that camp where we might expect that over the long term, an equilibrium interest rate might be lower than it used to be?
Well, the equilibrium real rate of interest in the sense of Wixell is really something that the globe shares. So we will not be alone in this. That's for certain. Nor are the forces really Canadian. They're global. And it just happens that I think some of the key ones, we happen to share them. So in that sense, then, it means that it's kind of an anchor point. So if, say, the Wixellian rate of interest were a certain number, then if you push interest rates below that number, then you get expansion. If that number is revised downwards because of these forces, then there's less room to maneuver underneath it. It also means that when you raise rates, at a certain time, like say if your economy is looking like we're inflationary, by the same token, it means that higher interest rates have an outsized effect, because they don't have to go as high as in the past in order to have the same impact on the economy. So it cuts both ways. It's kind of it's a subtle concept, and it'll be very hard for us to put a pin in that. It's more like learning as you go.
Okay, we'll go to Mike McDonald with CP.
In your speech, Governor, you mentioned the baby boom several times. Can you explain how it is that they're partially to blame, perhaps, for this new naturally low rate of interest rates?
Well, I would not use the term blame, but we would say on one token, it would be that during the past 30 or so years, while the baby boomers have been working, they have been boosting the trend line of economic growth. And now that bulge begins its inevitable exit from the workforce, that upward movement actually gets reversed. So we're calling attention to the future as opposed to the past. So if you wish to blame them for the future, you need to give them credit for the past. It's just something to take into account it's just to say that potential output for the world, and indeed for Canada, is not some mechanical straight line. It is something which very gradually moves around because of these fundamental changes.
And just a quick follow-up. In your speech, you seem to indicate that the economy may undershoot your expectations in the first few months of this year. Can you explain why you came to that conclusion or expectation?
Well, it's been in the numbers. We've seen both just not just in Canada, but elsewhere, especially in the United States, clear signs that the latest data from the first quarter, and indeed a little bit in December, have been softer than we would have been consistent with our view. But at the time, we were in the middle of major storm-related events, either snow or, in the case of December, actual power blackouts. So these things, of course, disrupt economic activity in very difficult to predict ways. Some of it will get caught up again, so that we would look for the rebound in the second quarter, in which case it's something you definitely see through. Some of it may not. So we'll have to do our analysis, do our best. I'm not in a position to update our forecast for you, but I'll do so in 4 weeks when we do the NPR.
Monsieur Landry.
Bonjour, Ricky Landry de
Bonjour.
Radio-Canada. Je ne vais pas vous demander de reprendre votre discours en français, mais expliquez un peu les grandes lignes. C'est quoi le message que vous êtes venu livrer à Halifax aujourd'hui?
Et dans les, excuse me. Les grandes lignes, c'est que l'économie est en transition vers un nouveau équilibrium. On s'attend à un taux de croissance plus élevé que le potentiel durant cette année et l'année prochaine, mais en convergence vers un taux de croissance plus bas que d'habitude à la fin de cette transition. Et cette tendance dans le futur, c'est influencé par les choses démographiques que j'ai mentionnées. C'est-à-dire que les inputs de l'économie, en particulier les travailleurs, là, ils vont diminuer graduellement parce que les forces démographiques, on prend notre retraite, c'est la vie. Alors, c'est-à-dire qu'on a commencé avec une tendance, puis on a eu une bulle, puis un cratère. Puis maintenant, on converge vers quelque chose d'autre et la tendance sera plus bas que la tendance originale à cause de ces effets démographiques. Ça marche?
Si la démographie limite le potentiel de croissance économique, comment voyez-vous l'avenir économique de la région atlantique où il y a beaucoup d'exodes, il y a une dénatalité importante, le taux de croissance à l'extérieur de quelques villes comme Halifax et peut-être Moncton, ça va dans le sens inverse.
Oui. Il y a beaucoup de choses en même temps. C'est certainement pas seulement à cause des effets démographiques, mais les effets démographiques, c'est vraiment quelque chose que tout le monde partage, pas juste ici au Canada, mais par toutes les régions du Canada et globalement. En même temps, nous avons une économie de 2 vitesses en ce moment. C'est l'économie d'énergie, en effet, et le reste de l'économie. Et ce niveau augmente, c'est bon, mais les 2 vitesses vont rester. Et ça, c'est le framework, l'encadrement qu'on doit analyser pour une économie régionale comme Nova Scotia.
Okay, Nirmala Menon, Wall Street Journal.
Governor, going back to the first quarter, what else could be behind the softness of the data? And also, from your speech, you suggested that the output gap would take 2 years to close. Are you now looking for it to close in the first quarter of 2016, based on that timeline?
I'm not in a position, Nirmala, to give you a new updated forecast today. The forecast that we have in the latest NPR in January is still our best thing that we've got. What we have seen is that numbers in the first quarter have been a little shy of what we were expecting. It's easy to point to the weather as a qualitative explainer, but it's hard for us to believe that all of that is just that, but we haven't made up our minds on this. If there's something else, it would be that, it just came up a little less than what we were expecting, but I emphasize little, because it's certainly would be within the normal margin of error. So this time, we don't really think the story has changed, but we'll put out a whole new story in a month's time. Apart from that, I think that's probably where I should leave it for today.
I have a question about your March 5th interest rate decision.
Yes.
You left out a reference to the Canadian dollar in that statement. I'm wondering, does that mean that you're happy with where the currency is now? Do you think it's fairly valued at around current levels?
Well, I have no particular view on that either way, but what I would say is that in the when we do the monetary policy report, we offer a much more complete, fulsome analysis of all the moving parts in the economy and how they may or may not be connected to the policy question. And so when we do the in-between announcement dates, we don't have a whole new monetary policy report. We're just bringing an update to the table and not mentioning everything that moves. I think it's as simple as that. There was no purposeful signal in leaving something out or adding something or what have you. It's just a question of what does the update require? And where does that leave us in terms of our policy decision? Are we still comfortable with it? And the answer was that we were, that we had expressed very clearly that we were in neutral territory, that we had to wait and see the forecast come true. So in prospect, we felt that the balance of risks was reasonably appropriate, both in January and then again in March, that we were roughly as comfortable as before.
Anyone else for a question? Yeah, at the back. Paul Withers with CBC.
Yep, thanks for taking the question. You're in a province right now and in a region right now that is experiencing record numbers of young people leaving this region to fill the resource economy out west. And that may be good for macroeconomic reasons, but each one of them is, for many, a tragedy, and individual families down here. It's also a part of the country that has dreadful demographics, an aging demographic that contributes less. So I'm wondering, when you're talking about demographics, we seem to have the perfect storm happening here, and I'm wondering what your prognosis is as the banker here, and if not, what suggestions you might have that would stem that.
Well, I'm aware that I think of those, as I said a few moments ago, as two separate sets of forces. The demographics are something that we all share. The migrations that you talk about are a product of that two-speed economy that I mentioned. And so, yes, although there are energy economies in more than one place in Canada, the one in Alberta has the stronger force of gravity associated with it and has been a net migration and commuting, if I can use the term, draw too. So people who work there but still live somewhere in the east. A model that was not very prevalent years ago, but is becoming much more common, I find. So what I want to help you appreciate is that the terms of trade shock, I'll refer you back to box 2 in the monetary policy report. I think it's box 2 or maybe box 1, but anyway, it's right early in the thing, where we show the box entitled Forces Acting on the Canadian Economy. And it identifies both the financial crisis and the immediate slowdown as force number 1, and the rise in the terms of trade for Canada as force number 2. Terms of trade, roughly speaking, means that the price of oil went up significantly. And, in broad terms, we would say the reason why the Canadian dollar is, and I'm not going to put a number on it, but I'll just say it's higher today than it was before all that happened. A key reason would be because price of energy went up, and that's our terms of trade for Canada. It's one of the key variables that tends to move the big movements in the Canadian dollar. And so that as a setup suggests that there are forces of equilibration going on beneath the surface that are inevitable. That no matter, as the economy recovers, which is what we're seeing, that two-speed economy and the forces that cause some movement from one region of the country to another will persist, possibly for a very long time, because it takes a long time for you to make those kinds of decisions. How do you change that? As I said in my speech, it's not something that you can just flick a switch and suddenly it changes, but I do think that governments are in a position to be judicious about how they remove impediments to growth, identifying them, continuing to improve business climate so it attracts business, all those kinds of things. And, I mean, I have very little more to say about that, except that, the best example that was asked about in there was the free trade agreement recently with Korea. That's the kind of thing which can have a very significant effect on many, many sectors in all regions of the country.
Okay, we'll go back to Greg Quinn with Bloomberg.
The dollar moved quite quickly down against the US dollar early this year. I know there's been a lot of maybe fog in the economy, but have you seen any early evidence that the weaker dollar is starting to change behavior on exports and inflation? Is the dollar already starting to make good progress and working its way through the economy?
I have no doubt that the staff will be presenting us with some new estimates along those lines for the upcoming NPR, but this process is just getting underway. To date, I've not seen anything that suggests we actually have a reaction to that. It's very early days, and in any case, I think as we discussed before, it's not expected to be the big thing that causes our trade performance to change. I think the big thing is the U.S. recovery itself. What matters is, do you have a customer? Is that customer ordering things? And then when the customer wants to buy something, then you're going to negotiate a contract price, and that negotiation can be influenced by what the exchange rate is or what it might end up being, just because that affects how much money the exporter ends up getting. The price to the buyer would be a U.S. dollar price, and they would never think about it. So all that to say that I really wouldn't expect to see much effect yet, Greg. We have almost no data since that happened.
We have time for one last question. Nirmala Menon, Wall Street Journal.
There's been some discussion recently with the Quebec election about the possibility of what would happen if they leave Canada. And the bank has been drawn into that about the use of the Canadian dollar, and they'd want a seat at the bank. How valid is that suggestion? Do you rule it out? I mean, have you started doing analysis of what would happen?
Well, I don't intend to comment on the subject in any way. Thank you.
Can I just
Quick follow-up, if you want to ask something.
This is coming back to the bank's decision. Can you, at this point, you said that you were neutral. You're on neutral now. The tone of your statement last week sounded slightly less dovish, but your speech today is being taken as more dovish. Can you rule out rate cuts at this point?
No, I cannot. I mean, when we say neutral, we mean literally neutral, which is to say that on our forecast, given the risks that we have identified and have analyzed, and the way those risks are expected to play out around our forecast, we think interest rates are at the right place right now to balance those risks. If the balance of risks were to shift so that the risks on the downside for inflation were increased, then we would need to reconsider that balance of risks and our position on that.
Okay, thank you, everyone. That's the end of the press conference. Merci. Bonne fin de journée.
Thanks, everybody.